The Judean road stretched out, a ribbon of cracked earth baking under the midday sun. Dust kicked up in thick, gray plumes with every step, coating the air and stinging the throat. Jesus moved forward, his pace steady, mounted upon the back of a small, patient donkey. The animal's hooves struck the hard-packed dirt with a rhythmic, dull thud that echoed against the silence. His gaze remained fixed forward, locked onto the distant, rising stone of the city walls. He reached a bend in the road where the incline sharpened, and the donkey slowed, its breath coming in short, labored puffs. Jesus leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the animal's neck, feeling the tension in its muscles as they climbed. The city of Jerusalem loomed larger now, its limestone ramparts stark against the deep blue of the sky. The silence of the road shattered the moment the city gates came into full view. A low hum, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, vibrated through the ground beneath the donkey's hooves. It grew into a roar as the crowd spilled out from the limestone archways, a sea of bodies pressing forward with a singular, desperate intent. Thousands of faces turned toward the road, eyes wide and searching. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, dry earth, and the frantic energy of a people waiting for a sign. Men pushed to the front, their shoulders locking to hold back the tide, while children climbed onto stone ledges to catch a glimpse of the traveler. The density of the crowd forced the donkey to a crawl, its ears twitching at the cacophony of shouts and rhythmic stomping. Every person in the throng leaned forward, their bodies angled toward the center of the path, creating a narrow, pulsing corridor of humanity. The heat of the day was eclipsed by the sheer warmth radiating from the mass of people. They were not merely watching, they were vibrating with a collective, jagged hope. The pressure of the crowd surged against the donkey's flanks, pushing it deeper into the city. The wall of sound rose higher, a deafening wave of expectation that seemed to swallow the very sky. The air filled with the sharp green scent of crushed leaves as the crowd turned toward the roadside palms. Hands reached upward, fingers locking onto sturdy fronds. With a violent, collective jerk, the wood snapped, and the branches were stripped away. The sound of tearing fiber echoed against the stone walls, a rhythmic, frantic percussion. People surged forward, trampling the dry earth, their faces fixed on the path before the donkey. One by one, they unfastened their outer layers, the heavy fabric sliding from their shoulders. They cast the garments down, layer upon layer, until the dusty road vanished beneath a carpet of woven wool and linen. The ground disappeared. The path became a tapestry of color and texture, muffling the sound of the donkey's hooves. Men knelt to smooth the fabric, their movements hurried and precise, ensuring not a single inch of dirt remained exposed. Women held the palm branches high, then laid them across the fabric, creating a bridge of greenery that stretched toward the city gates. The first shout erupted from the front of the line, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the heavy air. It was not a greeting, but a demand. Within seconds, the sound rippled backward, thousands of voices locking into a singular rhythmic cadence. The chant hammered against the stone walls of the city, the volume rising until the very ground seemed to pulse with the vibration. People threw their heads back, veins standing out on their necks as they screamed for deliverance. They were not asking for a teacher, they were calling for a commander. In their minds, the man on the donkey was the spark that would ignite the fire of rebellion. They saw the Roman garrisons already falling, the iron chains shattering under the weight of a new authority. The crowd surged forward, their bodies swaying in time with the chant, a living wave of defiance. Every face was flushed, eyes burning with the certainty of an imminent war. They pointed toward the city gates, their fingers tracing the path of a coming conquest. The air grew hot, charged with the static of 1,000 desperate hopes colliding at once. They shouted until their voices grew hoarse, each syllable a hammer blow against the status quo, convinced that the moment of their liberation had finally arrived. The massive stone archway of the city gate loomed ahead, casting a sudden, sharp shadow over the procession. As the donkey stepped into the darkness of the passage, the roar of the crowd hit the masonry and bounced back, a chaotic, hollow echo. Jesus did not look up at the battlements or the cheering faces pressed against the walls. He did not scan the horizon for the Roman guard or the palace of the governor. His posture remained rigid, his hands resting lightly on the donkey's neck. He moved through the gateway with a slow, deliberate pace, Ignoring the outstretched arms and the frantic pleas for a king to seize the throne, the noise of the city seemed to fall away from him. His gaze remained fixed, staring past the immediate stone and mortar, locked onto a point in the distance that no one else could see. There was no triumph in his expression, only a heavy, quiet resolve. He passed beneath the lintel, leaving the sunlight and the expectations of the mob behind. Every step forward was a measured movement toward a different destination. The path he walked was not toward a seat of power, but toward the wood of the cross. Monday morning light filtered through the high stone pillars of the temple, illuminating a thick haze of dust. Jesus stepped into the outer courtyard, and the silence of his approach was instantly swallowed by a wall of sound. It was not the sound of prayer. It was the frantic, rhythmic bleating of sheep penned against the walls and the sharp, repetitive lowing of cattle. Merchants stood in clusters, their voices rising in a constant, jagged pitch as they haggled over prices. Near the base of the pillars, money changers sat behind heavy wooden tables, their fingers moving with practiced speed. The metallic clink of silver coins hitting stone echoed across the floor, a cold, sharp percussion that cut through the air. Jesus walked slowly, his boots crunching on the grit that covered the paving stones. He moved past rows of cages, his eyes scanning the rows of men. He stood perfectly still, his presence a sudden, quiet anchor in the middle of the swirling, chaotic commerce. The atmosphere in the courtyard was thick with the scent of unwashed wool and the dry, acrid smell of dust kicked up by restless hooves. A merchant leaned over his table, his face twisted in a sneer as he snatched a coin from a trembling pilgrim, checking its weight against a small brass scale. The transaction was swift, devoid of any reverence, a purely mechanical exchange of value. Nearby, a man dragged a calf toward the altar area, the animal digging its hooves into the stone, leaving deep, jagged scratches on the floor. Every movement here was calculated for gain. The money changers did not look up, their hands moving in a blur of constant, rhythmic counting. They stacked silver in neat, gleaming piles that caught the morning light, creating a sharp, offensive contrast to the surrounding stone walls meant for quiet contemplation. A group of traders argued loudly over the price of doves, their voices echoing against the high ceilings, drowning out the faint, distant murmurs of those attempting to pray in the shadows. Jesus watched the scene unfold, his gaze tracking the flow of currency and the callous treatment of the animals. Every clink of metal against stone felt like a deliberate insult. He did not look away. The stillness that had held him finally broke. Jesus took a single, deliberate step forward, his focus narrowing onto the nearest heavy wooden table. The merchant behind it did not see him coming until a hand clamped onto the edge of the wood. With a sudden, sharp surge of force, Jesus heaved the table upward. It flipped with a heavy grinding sound against the stone floor. Silver coins, once stacked in orderly, gleaming piles, erupted into the air like metallic rain. They clattered across the paving stones, rolling into the cracks and under the feet of the startled crowd. The merchant stumbled back, his hands grasping at empty air as his ledger slid into the dirt. Jesus did not pause. He moved to the next station, his movements fluid and relentless. He gripped the heavy timber frame, his muscles straining as he tipped it over, sending cages and counting bowls crashing down. The air, previously thick with the sound of commerce, now vibrated with the sudden shock of the disruption. Coins skittered across the courtyard, spinning and ringing against the pillars. The courtyard erupted in panic. Merchants scrambled on their hands and knees, clawing at the stone to retrieve their scattered silver. One man reached for a heavy leather pouch, his fingers brushing the fabric, but a shadow fell over his hand. He looked up. Jesus stood over him, his presence blocking the path to the exit. The merchant froze, his breath hitching in his chest, and he pulled his hand back as if burned. "My house shall be called a house of prayer," the voice rang out, vibrating against the high stone walls. "But you have made it a den of thieves." The command was absolute. It carried the weight of a physical force, pushing the men backward. They abandoned their goods, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. They scrambled toward the gates, tripping over their own feet, desperate to put distance between themselves and the man who had dismantled their world in seconds. Cages of doves were left overturned, the birds fluttering frantically into the rafters. The money changers fled, leaving their ledgers and scales behind in the dirt. The space, once crowded with the noise of greed, grew suddenly, unnervingly hollow. Jesus turned, his gaze sweeping the now empty courtyard, the silence returning to the stone floor. The heavy gates of the city groaned shut behind him, sealing away the echoes of the temple. Jesus walked alone along the dusty track that wound through the rocky hillsides. The air here was thin and dry, smelling of parched earth and sun-baked stone. His pace was steady, though the long hours had left a visible fatigue. He stopped abruptly. A few paces off the path stood a fig tree, its branches spreading wide and heavy with leaves. It stood out against the barren landscape, a promise of shade and sustenance. Jesus turned from the path. He reached the trunk and looked up into the dense canopy. The leaves were lush, wide, and perfectly formed. He searched the inner branches, his fingers brushing against the rough bark. He moved to the other side, looking for fruit. There was nothing. Only the endless, empty green. He let the branch fall back into place, his gaze lingering. Jesus did not move. He stood beneath the canopy, his eyes fixed on the empty branches. The wind died down, leaving the air motionless and heavy. He drew a breath, his chest rising slowly, and then he spoke. The words were quiet, yet they carried a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet. He declared that no fruit would ever grow from the tree again. The effect was instantaneous. A tremor ran through the trunk, a violent shudder that shook the entire structure. The vibrant green of the leaves began to drain away, replaced by a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The edges of the foliage curled inward, crisping as if scorched by an invisible fire. One by one, the leaves detached from their stems, spiraling down to the dry earth in a sudden, brittle rain. The branches themselves lost their suppleness, turning gray and brittle, snapping under their own weight. The tree, which had appeared so full of life moments before, stood skeletal and hollow against the harsh sunlight. Jesus watched the transformation without blinking. He simply turned his back on the wreckage and stepped back onto the road, leaving the withered remains behind in the dust. The road back to the city gates was no longer empty. By the time Jesus reached the temple courtyard, the morning heat had intensified, turning the air thick and stagnant. The stone floor radiated a dry, oppressive warmth that rose to meet the soles of his feet. He moved through the archway, his stride measured and unhurried. The courtyard was already teeming with activity, a chaotic mix of voices and the restless shuffling of feet. He stopped near the center, his presence acting as a sudden anchor in the swirling crowd. The noise did not fade, but it changed. A group of men moved through the throng, their pace purposeful and synchronized. They did not come to trade or to pray. They fanned out, creating a semicircle that cut Jesus off from the rest of the plaza. They stopped a few feet away, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on his face. The air between them grew heavy with the weight of unspoken intent. Jesus stood still, his gaze meeting theirs. The first question came sharp and sudden, cutting through the ambient noise of the courtyard. A man stepped forward, his head tilted, eyes scanning the faces of the crowd to ensure they were watching. He posed a dilemma regarding authority, layering the query with legalistic precision that left no room for a simple answer. Jesus remained motionless, his expression unreadable as the words hung in the heat. Before he could speak, a second man interjected, shifting the focus to a matter of tribute and taxation. The trap was clear. Agree with the law and alienate the people, or defy the law and invite the wrath of the state. They crowded closer, their movements coordinated to box him into the center of the plaza. They fired their inquiries in rapid succession, each one more convoluted than the last, designed to force a stumble. The crowd grew silent, the earlier chaos replaced by a collective, breathless focus. The leaders gestured with open palms and pointed fingers, their voices rising in volume. They were not seeking truth. They were building a cage of logic. The final question echoed against the stone walls, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to press against the ears of everyone present. The leaders stood with their chins lifted, their chests heaving from the exertion of their verbal assault. Jesus did not look at the ground or toward the exits. He looked directly at the man who had spoken last. He took a slow, deep breath, his posture remaining perfectly balanced. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it carried across the plaza with absolute clarity. He did not argue the legal points. Instead, he began a story about a vineyard and the men who tended it. His hands moved in simple, rhythmic gestures as he described the master of the house. The leaders shifted their weight, their confident expressions faltering as the parable stripped away their complex logic. He spoke of watchfulness, of a master returning at an unexpected hour, and of the consequences for those who were found sleeping. He finished his point with a final, sharp observation about the stone the builders rejected. The leaders stepped back, their earlier momentum broken. The silence in the courtyard did not last. The leaders exchanged glances, their eyes darting between each other and the man who had just dismantled their logic. One man stepped forward, his jaw tight, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He did not ask another question. He stared, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The others followed his lead, abandoning the pretense of debate. They began to move, closing the distance between them and the center of the plaza. Their movements were no longer fluid or calculated. They were jagged and heavy. They formed a tight, semicircular wall, their shoulders brushing against one another, effectively cutting off any path of retreat. The air grew thick with a different kind of pressure, not the tension of a puzzle, but the friction of a hunt. They did not speak, but their presence was a singular, focused threat. They stood with their weight shifted onto the balls of their feet, ready to strike or to grab. The crowd sensed the shift. They backed away, creating a wider, empty ring around the confrontation. The leaders ignored the onlookers, their entire focus narrowed to a single point. Their faces hardened into masks of cold, calculated resolve. The time for words had ended, and the atmosphere in the temple courtyard turned brittle, waiting for the first sign of a physical break. The sun dipped below the western horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the stone floor of the temple. The aggressive circle of leaders did not strike. Instead, they slowly retreated, their boots scraping against the grit of the courtyard. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a sharp, biting chill that settled into the cracks of the city walls. The crowd dispersed, their voices fading into the narrow alleys, leaving the plaza hollow and echoing. The air felt thin, stripped of the earlier intensity, yet the quiet was heavy with a new, colder purpose. In the distance, the city gates groaned as they were pulled shut for the night. The transition was absolute. The focus of the conflict moved away from the light of the temple and into the windowless rooms where voices were kept low. A plan was being woven in the silence, a sequence of events set into motion by those who preferred the cover of the night. The group moved slowly through the narrow street, their figures blurred by the flickering light of a single torch. Judas kept his head low, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the alleyway. He walked at the rear, his pace slightly slower than the others, creating a growing gap between him and the rest of the followers. He stopped near a stone archway, pretending to adjust his sandal. The others continued forward, their voices muffled by the thick walls of the surrounding houses. He waited until they turned the corner, their silhouettes vanishing into the gloom. He did not call out. He did not look back. He stepped into the recess of a doorway, pressing his back against the cold, damp stone until the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. The alley was empty. He turned away from the path they had taken and moved in the opposite direction, his boots silent on the packed earth. He reached a junction where the shadows were deepest and paused, checking the street ahead. Finding it clear, he slipped into the darkness. The door stood heavy and reinforced, set deep into the stone wall of the inner courtyard. Judas reached out, his hand hovering over the iron ring before he gripped it and pushed. The wood groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a room illuminated by the flickering, low-burning flame of a single lamp. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of old parchment and cold incense. 3 men sat around a low table, their faces obscured by the deep shadows. They did not stand when he entered. They watched him with steady, unblinking eyes, their hands resting flat on the surface of the table. Judas stepped inside, the sound of his boots echoing against the stone floor. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking into place. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing in from all sides. He walked toward the center of the space, stopping just beyond the reach of the lamplight. The priests leaned forward, their movements synchronized and deliberate. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of the arrangement. One of the priests reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small, leather pouch. He held it suspended for a moment, the leather strained by the weight of the contents. He dropped it onto the wooden table. The impact produced a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Judas stared at the bag. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he untied the leather cord. He tipped the pouch, and the contents spilled across the scarred wood. 30 pieces of silver tumbled out, catching the weak light of the lamp. Each coin clinked against the others, a sharp, rhythmic sound that filled the stagnant air. Judas counted them with his eyes, his gaze moving from one coin to the next. The priests remained motionless, their hands folded in their laps, watching his every movement. He swept the silver back into the pouch, the metal scraping against the table surface. He pulled the cord tight, the leather biting into his palm. The transaction was complete. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. He shoved the pouch into his belt, the weight pulling at his side. He turned toward the door, leaving the priest behind in the shadows, and stepped out into the cold night air, the sound of the silver still echoing in his mind. The narrow stone stairs led upward to a room tucked beneath the city eaves. Disciples moved through the doorway, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. They set down their staffs and sat on the low benches, the wood creaking under their weight. Oil lamps hung from iron hooks in the ceiling, casting long, erratic shadows. Outside, the city of Jerusalem hummed with the distant noise of the evening, but inside, the air was stagnant and still. Jesus entered last. He closed the heavy wooden door, sliding the bolt into place with a slow, deliberate motion. As he turned to face the room, the low murmur of conversation died out instantly. No one spoke. The disciples shifted on their benches, eyes darting toward the corners of the room, then back to the center. The space felt constricted, the walls pressing inward as the light from the lamps began to dim. Jesus walked to the head of the table and stood there. He did not look at them. He stared at the empty space before him, his jaw set, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The dread was a physical presence, hanging in the air like smoke. Every man in the room remained motionless, watching the shadows lengthen, waiting. Jesus moved away from the table toward a corner of the room. He reached for a large clay pitcher and a basin resting on a low stool. He poured water into the basin, the liquid splashing against the ceramic sides with a sharp, clear sound that cut through the stillness. He set the pitcher down and picked up a length of linen cloth, tucking it into his belt. He walked back toward the disciples, his movements slow and measured. He stopped before the first man, who sat frozen on the bench. Jesus knelt on the hard stone floor. He reached out, took the man's foot, and placed it into the basin. The water rippled as he began to rub away the caked dust and grime of the road. His hands were steady, working the cloth between the toes and around the heel. He did not speak. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of water. He moved to the next man, repeating the motion with precise, repetitive care. Each disciple watched, their bodies rigid, their breath held tight in their chests. He worked his way down the line, the basin water darkening with the sediment of the journey. He did not look up, his focus entirely on the task. Jesus stood, the basin of water left behind on the stone floor. He walked back to the head of the table, his movements slow, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. He reached for a loaf of unleavened bread resting on the wooden surface. His hands gripped the edges, his knuckles white against the dry crust. With a sharp, sudden motion, he pulled the bread apart. The sound of the crust snapping echoed against the low ceiling. He laid the pieces out, his fingers lingering on the rough texture of the grain. He picked up a cup filled with dark wine and held it steady. The liquid caught the flicker of the oil lamps, casting a deep, crimson reflection onto his palms. He did not speak. He passed the bread to the man on his right, his eyes fixed on the disciple's face. He then lifted the cup, the weight of the vessel pulling at his arm, and held it out. His gaze swept across the room, meeting each man's eyes in turn. The air in the room grew dense, the silence pressing against the walls. He set the cup down with a dull thud, the wine sloshing against the rim. Jesus stepped out from the upper room, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a dull, final thud. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and distant smoke. He walked through the narrow, winding streets of Jerusalem, his footsteps rhythmic against the uneven cobblestones. The city was quiet, the crowds of the day replaced by long, jagged shadows cast by the moonlight. He moved past the city gates, leaving the stone walls behind as the terrain shifted to rough, unpaved paths. Branches of olive trees brushed against his shoulders, the leaves rustling with a dry, papery sound in the breeze. He reached the edge of the Garden of Gethsemane. The space was enclosed by gnarled, ancient trees that blocked out the stars. He walked deeper into the grove, the ground beneath his feet turning to soft, loose soil. The silence here was absolute, a heavy weight that seemed to press against the ears. He stopped in a small clearing, the moonlight filtering through the canopy in thin, silver slivers. He stood still, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The stillness of the garden deepened, pressing against his skin like a physical force. Jesus shifted his weight, his boots sinking slightly into the loose, dark soil. He reached out to steady himself against the rough, twisted trunk of an olive tree, his fingers digging into the bark. His muscles tightened, locked in a silent, internal struggle against an invisible burden. The air around him seemed to thicken, growing dense and suffocating. He took a sharp, jagged breath, his chest heaving against the sudden, crushing pressure that descended upon his shoulders. His knees buckled. He fought to remain upright, his jaw clenched, his heels grinding into the dirt, but the resistance was futile. He surrendered to the downward pull, his body descending until he hit the ground. His knees struck the hard, uneven earth with a dull thud. He did not look up. He pressed his palms flat against the soil, his arms shaking violently as they strained to support his torso. His entire frame shuddered, a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that rippled from his shoulders down to his feet. He bowed his head, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his focus entirely consumed by the immense, unseen weight that pinned him to the ground. He remained motionless, his forehead pressed toward the cooling earth. The night air was sharp, yet a feverish heat radiated from his skin, dampening the soil beneath his palms. He squeezed his eyes shut, his facial muscles twitching under the strain of a silent, internal cry. Slowly, the moisture on his brow thickened. It did not merely drip. It pooled, heavy and dark, tracing lines down his temples. He tilted his head, and the moonlight caught the viscous droplets as they fell. They were not clear like water, but stained with a deep, crimson hue. The physical agony surged, a tidal wave of pressure that made his veins stand out against his skin. He gripped the dirt, his fingernails tearing into the soft ground, trying to anchor himself against the overwhelming tide of his burden. His breath became a wet, rattling sound in his throat. Every fiber of his being was pulled taut, stretched to the point of breaking. He did not move to wipe the blood away. He simply endured, his body a conduit for a suffering that defied the natural order. The garden remained silent, the ancient trees standing as motionless witnesses to the transformation. The silence that had held the garden in a suffocating grip began to fray. At first, it was only a vibration in the ground, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that traveled through the soles of his feet. Then, the sound sharpened into the distinct crunch of iron-shod boots against dry twigs and stone. Jesus did not lift his head, but his muscles locked, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Beyond the perimeter of the olive trees, the darkness flickered. A jagged orange glow bled through the leaves, dancing erratically across the trunks, casting long, distorted shadows that reached toward him. The air grew thick with the smell of burning pitch and unwashed wool. Voices, low and harsh, cut through the night, punctuated by the metallic clatter of spear shafts striking the earth. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. As the line of light widened, torches swung in wide arcs, illuminating the dust motes. The rhythmic marching halted just beyond the grove. He felt the heat of the fire on his skin. The garden was no longer a place of prayer, but a trap. The heavy thudding of boots ceased, leaving a ringing silence in the grove. Jesus pushed his palms into the dirt, his knuckles white with the effort of rising. He stood slowly, his legs steadying against the uneven ground. He raised a hand to his face, wiping away the grit and the remnants of the night's struggle with a single firm motion. His skin was pale, but his eyes were clear, fixed directly on the flickering torches ahead. He did not retreat. He did not look for a path of escape through the shadows of the trees. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching rhythmically against the dry earth. The soldiers, clustered in a jagged line, shifted their weight. The iron heads of their spears caught the torchlight, reflecting a cold, harsh glare. As he approached, the men in the front row faltered, their grip on their weapons tightening. He moved with a precision that defied the chaos of the night. Every step brought him closer to the wall of steel and fire, yet he did not break his stride. He walked into the center of the light, his presence dominating the space, forcing the armed men to recoil as he closed the distance between them. Judas detached himself from the shadows behind the soldiers. He walked forward, his face tight, and stepped into the space between the guards and Jesus. He reached out, grabbing Jesus by the shoulders, and pressed his lips against his cheek. The signal was given. The guards surged forward like a breaking wave. Iron hands clamped onto Jesus' arms, fingers digging into his skin. The peaceful grove erupted in motion. Spears were leveled, their points glinting in the torchlight as the men crowded in. Jesus did not resist, but the sheer weight of the soldiers forced him back against the rough bark of an olive tree. Chains rattled, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the shouting. The guards looped the cold metal around his wrists, pulling them tight until the links bit into his flesh. The disciples scattered, their boots pounding against the dirt as they fled into the darkness. One guard shoved Jesus toward the gate, his hand gripped firmly on the back of his neck. They marched him out, leaving behind only the scent of smoke. The heavy iron gate groaned shut, cutting off the morning air. The soldiers dragged Jesus across the stone courtyard, his boots sliding against the slick, uneven surface. The transition was immediate. The open space of the garden was replaced by the high, vaulted ceiling of the hall. Every footfall echoed. Every breath sounded like a rasp against the cold, damp walls. The mob had already gathered outside, their voices rising in a rhythmic, discordant chant that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old dust and damp stone. The guards shoved him toward the center of the room, forcing him to his knees on the hard floor. The chains rattled, a sharp, metallic sound that pierced the rising roar of the crowd beyond the doors. Jesus did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light, piercing the high windows. The shouting from the street grew louder, a wall of sound pressing against the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the silence between the guards was brittle. One soldier paced, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, while another watched the door. The trial had begun. The room was a vacuum of tension. The heavy doors swung open, and Pilate stepped into the hall. He moved with a measured pace, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the figure kneeling in the center. The roar from the street surged, a physical force that rattled the oil lamps hanging from the rafters. Pilate stopped. He looked toward the balcony, where the sunlight blinded anyone trying to look out. A messenger leaned in, whispering into his ear. Pilate's jaw tightened. He glanced back at Jesus, then toward the doors where the mob pressed against the wood, their fists hammering in a steady, rhythmic beat. The hall was no longer a place of judgment. It was a pressure cooker. Pilate walked to the edge of the dais, his boots clicking sharply against the marble. He looked down at his own hands, then back at the crowd. He stood motionless, his back rigid, caught in the space between the prisoner's stillness and the violent demand of the people. Pilate raised a hand. A servant stepped forward, carrying a bronze basin filled with clear water. The sound of the metal clinking against the stone floor cut through the ambient noise of the hall. Pilate reached out, his fingers dipping into the basin. He began to rub his hands together, the water splashing softly against the rim. He did not look at the prisoner. He kept his eyes on the surface of the water, watching the ripples distort the reflection of the vaulted ceiling. The crowd outside caught sight of the movement, and the shouting faltered, then died into a low, expectant hum. Pilate continued the motion, scrubbing his palms and the backs of his hands with a slow, mechanical rhythm. He dried them on a cloth. He tossed the cloth aside, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. He turned away from the basin, his face set. He pointed a single, steady finger toward the guards. The soldiers moved instantly, their hands gripping the prisoner's arms. The decision was made. The water in the basin turned cloudy. The soldiers shoved Jesus toward the stone archway. He stumbled, his feet catching on the uneven threshold, but he regained his balance before the guards could strike. Outside, the midday sun hit with the force of a physical blow. A heavy, rough-hewn timber was dragged from the side of the courtyard and dropped onto his shoulders. The impact forced his frame downward. He braced his legs, his muscles tightening against the sudden crushing weight. The soldiers formed a tight perimeter, their spears held horizontally to clear a path through the gathering crowd. They moved into the narrow streets, the sound of iron-shod boots clattering against the cobblestones. Jesus took one step, then another, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. The wood bit into his shoulders, leaving deep indentations. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, watching the dust swirl around the feet of the soldiers. The procession turned a corner, leaving the shade of the buildings behind. The air grew hotter, thick with the smell of dry earth and sweat. They reached the city gate, the dark opening looming ahead like a mouth. Beyond it, the path began to rise, winding its way up the rocky slope of the hill. The summit of the hill was bare, swept clean by a dry, biting wind. The soldiers did not hesitate. They grabbed his arms, forcing him down onto the rough, splintered timber laid flat against the rock. He hit the wood hard, his breath hitching in his chest. A soldier knelt, pinning his right arm against the grain. The iron spike was thick, cold, and heavy in the man's grip. He positioned the point against the center of the wrist. The first strike of the mallet was a dull, wet thud that vibrated through the wood. The second strike drove the iron through the joint, tearing through skin and sinew. The sound was sharp, metallic, and final. His hand jerked, fingers spasming, but the iron held him fast. The soldier moved to the left side, repeating the motion with mechanical precision. Another strike, another tear. The iron bit deep into the bone, anchoring him to the timber. He lay pinned, his arms stretched wide. 4 soldiers gripped the upright beam, their muscles straining as they heaved the timber upward. The wood groaned under the shifting weight. Jesus was hoisted into the air, his body swaying as the cross tilted toward the jagged hole in the rock. With a final, coordinated push, the base slid into the cavity. The cross slammed against the stone floor with a bone-jarring thud. The sudden stop sent a ripple of tension through his frame, his head dropping forward. To his left and right, 2 other men hung from similar beams, their chests heaving in ragged, uneven gasps. A hush fell over the crowd gathered at the base of the hill. Some stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the center beam. Others paced the perimeter, pointing and shouting insults that drifted up on the wind. The sun beat down on the exposed ridge. The soldiers retreated a few paces, leaning on their spears to watch. The air was still heavy with the scent of dust and dry earth. The sun hung directly overhead, a white-hot disk in a cloudless sky. It was the brightest hour of the day. Then, the light began to change. It did not fade gradually. A gray film crept across the horizon, thickening until the blue was completely choked out. The heat that had been baking the rocks vanished, replaced by a sudden, biting chill that made the soldiers pull their tunics tighter. The crowd below stopped their jeering. The chatter died out, replaced by a low, uneasy murmur that quickly faded into total silence. The sky turned a bruised deep violet, then shifted into a heavy, impenetrable black. Stars appeared in the middle of the day, faint and cold against the void. The hill was swallowed. The faces of the men standing at the base of the cross became indistinct shadows. The air grew dense, pressing against the skin like water. No birds sang, no wind stirred the dust. The world seemed to hold its breath, locked in a sudden, suffocating eclipse. The only constant was the faint, ragged sound of breathing from the 3 men suspended in the dark. The sun was gone, and the day had become a tomb. The darkness remained absolute, a thick shroud that erased the horizon and the city below. Time seemed to have stalled within the void. Then, a sharp, ragged intake of air broke the stillness. It was a sound of immense effort, a desperate pull against the weight of the cross. The center figure shifted, his chest expanding with a final, violent surge of energy. He threw his head back, his neck cords straining against the dark. A cry erupted from his throat, raw and piercing, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. It was not a plea, but a sudden, thunderous release that echoed off the surrounding stone walls. The sound hung in the air for a heartbeat before fading into the black. Immediately, the tension left his frame. His shoulders slumped forward. The grip of his fingers on the wood loosened, slipping until only the nails held him in place. His head dropped to his chest. The ragged breathing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness, a total cessation of movement. Below, the soldiers stood frozen, their spears lowered, staring into the void where the man had been. The hill was quiet. The body hung motionless. The soldiers moved first, their boots crunching on the loose shale as they approached the base of the hill. They carried iron hammers and long, heavy pincers. One by one, they climbed the ladders. The sound of metal striking metal rang out, sharp and discordant in the stagnant air. They pried the nails from the wood, the iron groaning as it yielded to the force. The body sagged, then slipped into the arms of the men waiting below. They caught him, their muscles straining under the sudden, dead weight. They laid him on a flat stretch of rock, his skin pale and cold against the gray stone. Followers stepped forward with bundles of linen. They began the work of cleaning the wounds, their hands moving with practiced, rhythmic precision. They wrapped the limbs, binding the fabric tight until the form was hidden beneath the white layers. They lifted the bundle, the weight distributed between them, and began the slow descent down the path. The crowd had long since dispersed, leaving only the sound of footfalls on the dirt. They walked past the city walls, toward the garden where the rock-hewn tomb waited. The entrance was a dark, square mouth in the hillside. They placed the body inside, the stone floor scraping against the linen. The heavy circular stone sat in its groove, waiting. Two men pressed their shoulders against the rough, carved surface, their boots digging into the loose gravel. With a low, grinding roar of rock against rock, the stone shifted. It rolled forward, gathering momentum until it slammed into the recessed frame of the tomb entrance. The sound echoed briefly, then died. Dust settled in the air, coating the surrounding shrubs in a fine gray powder. The men stood back, wiping their palms on their legs, their breathing heavy and rhythmic. They turned away, leaving the tomb sealed behind them. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the garden. By the next morning, the city had retreated into a state of unnatural quiet. No merchants called out in the marketplace. No animals stirred in the pens. The wind died down, leaving the trees motionless. The air felt thick, as if the world itself had stopped moving. Every street was empty, the doors bolted tight against the lingering heat. The tomb remained a dark, immovable object in the center of the garden, its stone seal undisturbed, while the world outside held its breath. The first light of Sunday morning touched the top of the garden walls, turning the gray stone to a pale, washed-out gold. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves. A group of women walked up the path, their footsteps muffled by the soft, dew-covered grass. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The heavy, circular stone that had sealed the tomb was no longer in its groove. It sat several feet away, tilted against the side of the rock face, leaving the dark interior of the tomb exposed to the morning air. They stepped inside. The space was empty. The burial cloths that had been wrapped around the body lay in a pile on the stone floor, the linen strips loose and discarded. There was no sign of a struggle, only the quiet, hollow space. One of the women turned, her gaze catching a figure standing near the olive trees. The man stood in the soft light, his face clear in the morning sun. He spoke a single name. The sound cut through the lingering silence of the garden. The women moved forward, their pace quickening as they reached the spot where he stood. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp, clear light across the garden floor. The women turned away from the tomb, their pace rapid as they moved toward the city gates. They did not look back at the discarded linen or the displaced stone. Their path was no longer defined by the weight of the previous days, but by the momentum of the morning. In the city, the streets began to stir. Shutters opened, and the sound of trade returned to the marketplace. The heavy, stagnant air of the past 2 days dissipated, replaced by the warmth of a new day. People gathered in the squares, their voices rising in sudden, sharp bursts of conversation. The news traveled from the garden to the walls, then through the gates and into the heart of the city. Every step taken by those leaving the tomb carried the weight of a finished task. The cycle of the week had been broken. The stone remained cast aside. The tomb stood empty, its purpose exhausted. As the sun reached its zenith, the shadows in the garden shrank, leaving the entire space bathed in light. The city settled into a different rhythm as the afternoon waned. The frantic energy of the morning gave way to a steady, deliberate movement. Merchants packed their stalls, and the dust on the Judean road began to cool under the lengthening shadows. The news had reached the furthest edges of the city, changing the way people walked and the way they spoke. No one looked toward the hill of the tomb with the same dread as before. The heavy, rock-hewn entrance remained open, a dark gap in the hillside that no longer held a secret. The linen cloths lay undisturbed in the dust, forgotten relics of a finished ordeal. Outside the walls, the fig trees stood still in the evening breeze, their leaves catching the final orange glow of the sun. The path that had once led to a place of mourning now served as a thoroughfare. The silence of the garden was no longer heavy or oppressive. As the first stars appeared, the landscape stood transformed. The road ahead remained clear, wide, and open for all who chose to walk it. Night fell over the Judean hills, but the darkness lacked the weight of previous nights. The path leading from the garden remained visible under the pale light of the moon, a clear, unbroken line stretching toward the horizon. No guards patrolled the perimeter of the tomb. No torches flickered near the entrance. The stone, rolled far from the opening, sat half buried in the dirt, its work finished. Inside the city, the gates remained unbarred, and the streets held a quiet, steady peace. The events of the week had etched themselves into the very geography of the region. The temple courtyard was empty. The dust settled on the stone floor where tables had once stood. The fig tree, now silent in the dark, stood as a marker of the time that had passed. Every landmark served as a testament to the change that had taken hold. The road was no longer a route to a place of confinement, but a passage leading outward. As the moon reached its peak, the entire landscape rested in a state of absolute, resolved stillness. The story, once confined to the narrow streets of the city, now extended into the vast, quiet expanse of the world, leaving only the clear, unobstructed road behind. The morning sun rose over the hills, casting long, sharp shadows across the road that stretched toward the horizon. The dust had settled, and the ground was firm underfoot. Every stone and every turn in the path remained as a physical witness. The city gates stood wide, no longer a barrier, but a threshold leading into the open country. The temple, the garden, and the hill were now quiet, static features of the landscape, stripped of their former tension. The air was clear, and the wind moved freely through the valley, undisturbed by the sounds of crowds or the weight of judgment. The road did not end at the city walls. It continued, winding through the hills and disappearing into the distance. The cycle of the past had reached its final point, leaving behind a world that was fundamentally different in its stillness. The path remained open, a physical invitation. The journey had reached its destination, and the road stood ready under the steady light. The sun dipped toward the western ridge, casting a final, golden light across the valley floor. The road, worn smooth by the passage of time and the events of the week, stretched out until it merged with the darkening horizon. Every stone along the path sat undisturbed, and the dust remained settled, marking a stillness that had not existed before. The city walls stood silent, their shadows lengthening as the day drew to a close. No movement disturbed the quiet of the fields. The garden, the hill, and the city gates were now part of a landscape defined by this new, enduring peace. The wind died down, leaving the air motionless and clear. The path did not veer or break, it held its course. The ground remained firm, the horizon remained open, and the road stood ready. As the last light faded from the peaks, the entire expanse of the land rested in a state of absolute, final completion. The journey had reached its end. The night deepened, and the last traces of color vanished from the sky. A cool air settled over the valley, firming the earth and cooling the stones of the road. Above, the stars appeared, one by one, casting a thin, silver light that traced the outline of the path through the dark fields. The city gates were now silhouettes against the star-filled horizon, motionless and silent. Every detail of the landscape, from the dry grass to the uneven ground, stood in sharp relief under the pale glow. There was no sound of movement, no echo of voices, and no shift in the wind. The road remained, a physical ribbon of dust and stone that cut through the silence, stretching toward the edge of the world. The cycle had concluded, leaving behind a world that was still resolved and entirely at peace. Nothing moved. The road remained. The darkness began to thin, replaced by a pale gray light creeping across the eastern hills. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and cooling stone. As the light intensified, the road emerged from the shadows, its surface distinct and clear against the surrounding fields. The city walls caught the first rays of the sun, turning from black silhouettes to solid, warm stone. Every contour of the ground, every pebble, and every turn in the path became visible in the steady rising light. The silence of the night gave way to the subtle, rhythmic sounds of a world waking up. Yet the road itself remained unchanged. It stretched forward, a physical connection between the city and the horizon, holding its place in the landscape. The dust settled, the stones held firm, and the path remained open, leading toward the edge of the visible world. The sun climbed higher, flooding the valley with clear, white light that erased the last remnants of the dark. The landscape stood fully revealed, static, and resolved. The journey had reached its absolute conclusion, leaving behind a world that was still clear and complete. The sun climbed to its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows across the Judean road. Heat shimmered above the dry ground, blurring the distant horizon where the path met the sky. Every stone, every rut, and every grain of sand held its place in the brilliant, unwavering light. The wind died down, leaving the air heavy and still. No movement disturbed the surface of the road. The city walls stood solid, their stone faces baking in the midday glare. The silence was absolute. The path stretched forward, a permanent, unchanging line etched into the landscape, connecting the past to the present. There was no sound of footsteps. The road remained, a fixed feature of the world, complete and resolved. The cycle of the week had left its mark upon the ground. The light held steady, the dust remained settled, and the landscape stood in total silent clarity. The journey had reached its final point, leaving behind only the road, waiting under the sun, resting in the absolute peace of the day.